BYU is saying goodbye to the man that many consider to be the bedrock of BYU Athletics. After 20 years, Tom Holmoe is stepping aside. What does it mean for BYU that he is stepping aside, and what's next for the BYU Cougars?
You are Locked On Cougars, your daily podcast on the BYU Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everybody? I'm Jake Hatch, your host here on Locked On Cougars, resident BYU insider. Thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day, and more importantly, thank you to all of you who we like to call our everydayers right here on your original daily podcast focused on the BYU Cougars. Today's show is first time, actually, I can remember, I think, in this podcast history of going live on YouTube. So you guys are getting like the raw cut here. So if I screw something up, understand that this is a first-time foray, but big news. We're going to talk about Tom Holmoe's legacy as BYU Athletic Director. We'll also talk about who might be in line to replace him. There's a lot of names out there, and I've done, I think, a pretty thorough job at writing down my initial list of candidates we'll get to, and then we'll finish up today's podcast with some additional thoughts on BYU basketball and a huge win for them on the road against the West Virginia Mountaineers. All right, so without further ado, BYU Athletics is saying farewell to a guy that means a ton, and I mean a ton, to Brigham Young University, and that's BYU Director of Athletics Tom Holmoe. He announced just earlier this afternoon of breaking news that he was going to step aside at the end of this athletic year. So what does that mean? When is he stepping aside? Well, in theory, let's say a team like BYU baseball were to make a run to the College World Series. That could mean that Tom Holmoe's run with BYU could run all the way through June. Now, with BYU baseball being among the bottom of the Big 12, I would think that he's probably more done the early summer range. We're talking probably early June. And then what's next? That's a big question mark that remains unanswered. We should get some more details on that tomorrow when BYU President C. Shane Reese will speak to the media, and obviously it's going to be on TV. Tom Holmoe will also address questions about his legacy and his tenure. So we'll get some more details on the timeline, et cetera, for BYU then. But quite frankly, I have a hard time kind of remembering what BYU was before Tom Holmoe. I'll just give you a little bit of background. Tom Holmoe was hired at BYU in that 2004 to 2005 era. And remember, there was so much upheaval in that time. Gary Croton was going through the midst of 3 losing seasons with the BYU football program and ultimately forced to resign. Val Hale had come to the end of his run as BYU Athletic Director, and Tom had come over to BYU in 2002 as the Associate Athletic Director of Development and then was elevated to the head job. I do remember, and this is 20 years ago, so pardon me if my memories aren't completely clear on this, but I do remember I was a high school senior at the time, I believe, when Tom was hired. It's crazy to think that 20 years later, he's stepping aside, but there were question marks if Tom would be able to really lead BYU the way that BYU Athletics needed to be led at that time. Well, what did he do? He went out and hired Bronco Mendenhall as his first football hire as head coach. Bronco proved to be an incredible hire, 99 wins during his run at BYU over 11 seasons. Dave Rose was his basketball hire when Steve Cleveland decided to head to Fresno State. Steve Cleveland obviously left a strong legacy, but Dave Rose took it and ran with it and built upon it, and obviously had some absolutely epic runs. He's also since hired guys like Kalani Sitake. He hired Mark Pope. He's hired Kevin Young. And those are just the basketball and football hires that are the hallmarks of his 20-year career. You can think of guys like Sean and Heather Olmstead, who I guess guy and girl, sister and brother, Sean and Heather Olmstead, who were hired as the volleyball coaches and have had very strong runs. He has kept Jennifer Rockwood's program with BYU soccer sailing along. There are so many things that Tom Holmoe accomplished during his run at BYU that I don't think this podcast in any way, shape, or form can really do it true justice. But the other thing about this is the university under his tenure won 4 national championships, 133 conference regular season and postseason championships. He ushered BYU from the Mountain West era. Remember, there was so much upheaval in that 2009-2010 period with conference realignment. He saw TCU jump to the Big 12. He saw Utah jump to what was then the Pac-10, ultimately became the Pac-12, and realized, hey, this is an untenable situation for us at BYU to be stuck in the Mountain West with the Mountain contract and everything else that was going on in that conference, the politics, etc. Well, what does he go out and do? He goes out and negotiates an exclusive rights media deal with ESPN for BYU football in particular, ushers them into independence, and had Utah not scuttled their plan to be essentially an associate member of the WAC, well, they pivoted and joined the West Coast Conference, had a strong run in that conference. After a strong run during independence, and I don't think anybody can argue anything than it being a strong run, they were dealt a pretty tough hand, but proved that BYU was one of the few universities in this day and age of college athletics that could make independence work and could make it a viable option for the university. There was the rumors in 2016 about BYU joining the Big 12 Conference. He and his cohort, speaking of Tom Holmoe, chased that and ultimately never got that invite at that time. Well, what happens 6 years later? BYU gets that coveted invite from the Big 12 Conference to join the Power 5, now ultimately the Power 4 ranks. And he has ushered BYU from, like I said, the Mountain West into independence, the West Coast Conference in terms of the Olympic sports, and now into really the heyday of BYU Athletics as a member of the big time, as a member of the Big 12 Conference. It is truly remarkable what Tom Holmoe has accomplished at BYU. There is no other way that you can cut it other than to say that he has been an absolutely incredible athletics director for Brigham Young University. I had heard rumors over the last 5 or so years that Tom was considering stepping aside. And I was always kind of brushing it off. Like, no, he's a BYU guy. Remember, this is a guy who played at BYU and went on to coach in the NFL, won 3 Super Bowls as a player for the San Francisco 49ers, 1 as a coach, and has 4 Super Bowl rings. But when he had a chance to come home to Provo and come home to BYU, didn't hesitate in doing it. And he has been absolutely stellar in what he has accomplished for BYU. His legacy will go right up there among the greatest ADs in BYU athletics history. Think of Elaine Michaelis. Think of Stan Watts. There are so many great administrators. Glenn Tuckett, Rondo Felberg. There are great college administrators and athletic directors in BYU athletics history. I would put Tom Holmoe and his credentials, his resume, whatever you want to term it, up against any of them and argue that he was among the most impactful, if not the most impactful, in BYU athletics history. There is going to be some pretty sizable shoes. His legacy, the shadow that he will cast over BYU athletics, those shoes that will need to be filled, they are sizable and they are going to be tough to fill. Whoever takes on this job, and we'll talk more about who I see as the short list, not my short list, but my initial list of candidates to replace him in a moment. But whoever does take over this job, good luck to him because they have a strong position. The nice part is Tom's not leaving BYU high and dry. He's not leaving them in a bad spot. The thing that is that BYU just came off an absolutely incredible football season, an 11-2 record. Basketball, it's in a fairly good spot across the athletics department. They're in the best position they've ever been financially and otherwise. And I think that he leaves BYU in a good spot. And in theory, whoever gets this gig taking over as the director of athletics at BYU, they should be able to take that baton and really just run with it. It's not going to require rebuilding. It's not going to require retooling. Everything is in place for the next person that sits in that chair to really just roll with it. And I think they could do some special things, and Tom has set that up to make that transition, I think, about as smooth as it possibly could be in this circumstance. All right. So who is up? Who could step in to those sizable shoes as I talked about for Tom Holmoe? Well, I have been working the phones all day long, doing research, trying to get a feel for who might be out there that BYU could tab to take over as BYU athletics director, and we'll delve into that coming up next right here on Locked On Cougars. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at Wayfair. After the holiday hustle, there's nothing like giving your home a little TLC and obviously getting the new year off to a strong start. Whether you're tidying up, clearing out, or just want to give your space a new look or start the year the right way, Wayfair is everything you need, and the best part is all within your budget. There's something for every style and every home, no matter your space, the size, and the budget you have to work with. I also really like whatever your decor style is, and I admit my wife is the one that really handles the decor at my house, but the good news is she can fit whatever she wants to her heart's content with our friends over at Wayfair. All of us want to have a place that we can call our own, and it fits our personality. That's what Wayfair is here for, you guys. So take advantage of it today. It makes it easy to tackle all of your home goals this year and get your home the refresh it needs with our friends over at Wayfair. Go ahead to wayfair.com right now. That's WAYFAIR.com. That's wayfair.com. Of course, it's all, every style, and it's all for every home. Thank you once again for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. Live stream of this podcast. I'm actually not wholly comfortable with this, but it's kind of fun at the same time to get the live reaction. So thank you to all of you who have tuned in and have joined us on this live edition of the podcast. All right. Without further ado, I unveil my initial working list as to who I believe could take over as BYU Athletics director in the wake of Tom Holmoe's retirement. I'm going to throw this up here. It's a full screen and deal with it. It's a Google Doc. So here we are. We have internal candidates and what I consider to be external candidates from BYU. There are three principal internal candidates. Obviously, Brian Santiago has been just an absolutely stalwart deputy AD to Tom Holmoe. He would be on my short list for the favorites at this juncture to take over the job because he's been biding his time. Brian's been very, very good as an administrator over basketball. He's worked very well in the NIL space for BYU. And obviously, him being around BYU as much as he has, should give him a chance to move over essentially a seat and take over as BYU AD. Next one up, Liz Darger. She is the senior associate AD and also the senior woman administrator for BYU Athletics. Liz has been working at BYU for quite some time. Many of you might not know who she is, what she does, but I can tell you, she is a force in college athletics. She is highly respected around the country. She also has a great love for BYU and its mission. And I know that in this day and age, we want to talk about hires that can make an impact. Hiring a person like Liz Darger as BYU's athletic director, I think would signal a really strong move by the board of trustees and the LDS Church. But Liz has got the credentials. I like I said, I know that many of you may not be aware of her name, but she's done a lot of stuff behind the scenes for BYU Athletics that really kind of goes unnoticed. The other name to keep an eye on internally, Chad Lewis, the former BYU tight end, the Philadelphia Eagle. He is working right now as the associate AD for development. So the job that Tom Holmoe ascended from, associate AD for development, into the top job is the job that Chad Lewis is in right now. Chad is about as affable a personality as you're going to find in the athletic department. He is well-liked, loved. Obviously, his time playing for BYU football has a lot of people out there thinking that he could be a rock star as the next AD for BYU. But those three absolutely should and will, I would imagine, get interviews to take over this post. They are strong internal candidates. And if the board of trustees, guys like Shane Reese and Keith Vorkink, who lead BYU as the university president and obviously the advancement vice president in the case of Keith Vorkink, they want to keep it in-house and keep it rolling. Those three are on the short list, I think, for the gig. Now, if BYU decides to look outwards, and I believe that they should entertain all options on this job, who else could they look at? Well, you have names like a Craig Angelos. Now, some of you may know Craig Angelos, played baseball for BYU. He was most recently the athletic director at the University of Hawaii out there in Honolulu. He was unceremoniously dumped from his position after having a very strong start to his tenure. There were a lot of people who thought he was doing some special stuff for Hawaii, and then the university president decided to essentially whack him, and he's been unattached since then. He has worked all over the country. I could go through his resume, and it includes like Miami, Long Island. He's worked at like every level of college athletics and comes with a strong resume. And like I said, played for BYU baseball and is a Salt Lake City native. So maybe he wants to come home and be a BYU. Next one up, Jerry Bovee, formerly the deputy AD at Utah State University. Now, I will admit, Jerry is a bit of a long shot in my mind because he has got a lawsuit and a grievance and different pending legal matters with Utah State after he was let go from his position. He has been fighting that, and I don't know how that might impact the chances of him ending up at BYU, but he is a guy that's been around athletics, college athletics, for a long time. Had a really strong run at Weber State. I thought had a really, really good run at Utah State as well before being let go by Diana Sabo, but I don't know how the pending legal situation might impact him. Peter Pilling, a guy who was actually in the mix when Tom Holmoe was hired at BYU, has been at Columbia for a decade now in the Ivy League. My only question about Peter is he too old now? I think he, much like Tom, is in his 60s. Is he past what BYU wants in terms of an age for an athletic director? But as we all know, age is just a number. But Peter Pilling, longtime administrator in his own right, and is a sitting AD right now. Another sitting AD just up the road from BYU, Jared Sumption, currently working at Utah Valley University. I think he's done some really good things at UVU, and he may be looking to take the next step, obviously, and he could be a strong candidate. If they want another senior women administrator, another female candidate, Kathy Nixon, who's the UVU associate AD and a former BYU basketball coach, she could be in the mix as well. So 2 candidates just up the road with the UVU Wolverines. Then I come to Danny Ainge, Utah Jazz CEO. Now, much like I just mentioned with Peter Pilling, Danny's now in his 60s. I know that he is a BYU basketball super fan. He shows up to every home game. He is a beloved legend at BYU. Would he consider stepping away from the front office life with the Utah Jazz and want to take over BYU Athletics? Maybe worth kicking the tires on and saying, hey, Danny, what do you think? But he was the name I came up with. Another one out of left field who would be a proverbial big fish out there, Scott O'Neil. Now, some of you know the name Scott O'Neil, some of you don't, but he's been working for Merlin Entertainment. He's a longtime NBA executive for the Philadelphia 76ers, and just recently, I think like a month ago, took over as the CEO of Live Golf. Obviously, Greg Norman had been in the CEO role since Live had been founded. He has stepped aside, and Scott O'Neil has slid into that spot. He is a high-powered, highly thought of, just athletics mind. He's done everything in sports, it feels like. And O'Neil probably wouldn't come cheap, because when you're working for Live, we all know that they are flashing all kinds of cash out there in the world. And the other thing about it is you look at him and what he's capable of doing potentially for BYU Athletics, he would raise the profile for BYU. Think of Scott O'Neil. Remember when Kevin Young was hired from BYU basketball and what he brought in terms of the reputation, et cetera, to BYU? That's what Scott O'Neil could be. Like I said, it's not going to come cheap, because when you're making the money he's probably making right now, tough to do it. And the final name I came up with, and it comes from a couple of our Locked On Cougars Insider listeners, Steve Young. Now, Steve, obviously, much like a Danny Ainge, much like Chad Lewis, a beloved BYU football or BYU athletics legend. Steve is well past his playing days, but since he got done playing, he's got a law degree. He runs a very, very successful, what do you call it, a venture capital firm out there in the Bay Area. Hey, does Steve want to take over his next deal and be running BYU Athletics? It's worth kicking the tires on as well. So that's kind of my list I came up with. I'm sure there'll be other names that pop up as this hunt progresses, because we just don't know the timeline quite yet. We'll learn more about that tomorrow when we speak with Tom as well as Shane Reese. But that's what I got for you guys. Those are who I have on the list. And by the way, if you have others that you would like to see on the list and you have names that you're thinking of, feel free to drop them in the comments below. Drop them in a YouTube comment, or send them to us via social media or email, lockedonbyu@gmail.com. Let us know. But there are going to be no shortage of options out there when it comes to this position, both internally and externally. BYU is in a very, very good spot. They're a new member of the Power Four. They obviously have been handling their finances the right way. Like I said, this is not an athletic department that is in the red and you're having to come in and cut things to be able to manage the budget. Everything that goes on for BYU right now is in a good spot. And Tom Holmoe, like I said, has just set it up for BYU to really just keep it rolling here. So that's who I have in terms of candidates to take over that position. But there will be a lot more. And by the way, I'll just add this. I said this on social media on Locked On Cougars. You, as of right now, as the recording of this podcast, you could be a candidate for the BYU Athletic Department, BYU Athletics Director job, because really anybody's a candidate right now. So think about that. That'd be pretty fun to take over that gig. But nonetheless, a lot of strong options out there. And BYU, like I said, we'll have no shortage of options out there for them as they move forward here. And we'll have more for you guys in coming days and weeks on this. We'll do a podcast tomorrow, let you know more of maybe what the timeline is, what they're thinking of BYU. If more names emerge as candidates for the gig, I'll be sure to pass them along right here on the podcast. All right, we'll finish up today's show by flipping over to BYU basketball. We want to talk about a huge win for BYU. They go to Morgantown and essentially, I think, have reignited their chances of making the NCAA tournament with a single win. I talked about it yesterday. It was essentially win and get in, or lose and go home, and they won, and they're back in. So we'll talk about that and what BYU basketball needs to do now as they get ready for a Kansas double dip this coming weekend and early into next week. We'll dig into that coming up next right here on Locked On Cougars. Thank you once again for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. Hope you all are doing well out there. I mentioned a little bit earlier our Locked On Cougars Insider Group. It's a great way to interact with the show, support the show as well. Just $5 a month to get the inside scoop on all things BYU that I am hearing. If you would like to be a part of it, click the link in the show notes below, whether you're watching this on YouTube or get it wherever you get your podcast. And the best part is the kicker for this. You get 2 full weeks, 14 days before you're charged anything, and the updates come to your phone in the form of a text message. No message boards to log into or having to go to a website to get the inside intel. It comes to your phone in the form of a text message. Does not get much more direct than that. So join us today on the Locked On Cougars Insider Group. All right, BYU basketball, huge win against the West Virginia Mountaineers, 73-69, and this game has reignited BYU's chances of staying in the NCAA tournament field. Joe Lunardi, as many of you know, the bracketologist supreme, said this earlier today. BYU West Virginia was on his headlines of what the day would entail for basketball. He said this: BYU falls out of the field with a loss and Arkansas moves in. Well, BYU won this game and have reestablished themselves in that the last 4 in right now in the NCAA tournament field. The other thing about this game against West Virginia for BYU is it's a quad 1 game. BYU's been lacking severely in the quality wins department. They now have 3 of them. West Virginia is the 3rd, and it sets up BYU for a really, really big opportunity this coming Saturday and the following Tuesday when Kansas State comes to the Marriott Center on Saturday evening, and then obviously Kansas, the Jayhawks, making the trek to Provo the following Tuesday. If you can split those games, BYU's right back in the mix when it comes to their chances of going dancing. You sweep those games, and it feels like you may have the inside track and you may have locked yourself up a spot. So it's crazy to think that one game could do it, but I said it on yesterday's podcast for those of you who are everydayers. That game against West Virginia, it really kind of held the key to BYU's chances of going dancing or looking at the NIT and as their postseason options. I didn't mean to come off as fatalist or hot takey, but it really felt that way because consider BYU had lost back-to-back games against Arizona and against Cincinnati, and we're sitting at 6-6. Well, now you're 7-6. Now you can go out there with some confidence after a strong win against West Virginia and think, okay, we got everything in front of us. This game, I do have to say it was a full team effort. It was cool. Remember, against Cincinnati, late in that game, Mihailo Boskovic as well as Trey Stewart came in and put together a run that got BYU back into that game. Kevin Young stuck with that lineup a little bit too long, and it burned them in the end after they get it blown out by Cincinnati. But those 2 guys, Kevin Young said it earlier this week as well as post-game, had earned themselves an opportunity to play more for BYU. Well, how do they reward their head coach for his belief in them? Well, they go out and have very impactful games. Trey Stewart hit multiple 3-pointers for the first time in his BYU career. Really impressed with what he offered to BYU. Came in and hit a big 3 off the bench at the end of the first half. Had a strong second half. I think he ended up with 8 points. I'm just pulling up the box where 8 points on 3 of 3 shooting. Really strong game for him. And then Mihailo Boskovic, remember that final stanza of the game. West Virginia said, okay, that ball's going to Richie Saunders. We're going to blitz him. Well, what does Mihailo do? He sets a ball screen. Richie, as he always does, seems to make a play, finds Boskovic, and Boskovic knows exactly what to do with the clock running down. Goes right to the rim, gets fouled, and makes the free throw, puts BYU up 4, and that's all she wrote for BYU. I would say my players of the game for BYU, even though they didn't have the starring roles all game long, Mihailo Boskovic and Trey Stewart. They were indicative of guys who have been stuck and glued to the bench for long stretches of the season. And when Kevin Young and BYU needed them, they stepped up. That was really cool to see that. I also really liked what I saw from Jaeger Demon. 16 points, 6 of 12 from the field, just 1 of 4 from 3. But Jaeger continues to show that he is growing and getting better with every single game. My hopes of him sticking around at BYU are fading very, very quickly. They already weren't very high, but the more he has success against teams like West Virginia, who are very good defensive teams, indicate to me that he may not be long for BYU and Provo. Cannon Catchings, the only other guy, funny enough, for BYU in double digits. Cannon Catchings, 2 of 4 from the field, 2 of 3 from 3, but more importantly, 5 of 6 from the free throw line. Those free throw woes that BYU's had all season long, very strong game today. 13 of 16, 81.3%. Not their best three-point shooting night, 10 of 28, 35.7% from the field. But if you watch West Virginia defend, they were absolutely intent on making it so that BYU couldn't get their shots where they wanted them from the three-point line. They wanted to push BYU off those spots. So I thought it was overall a strong performance. I will also add this. In the first half, BYU had 9 turnovers, and those contributed to 13 points off those turnovers that helped West Virginia take a 34-32 lead. In the second half, let me make sure I get this right here. The overall turnovers for BYU in this game, 12. Turnovers have been an absolute just killer for BYU in these games. Just 3 in the second half. That's a huge key as to why BYU was able to get this victory. They took care of the basketball in the second half. I don't know what Kevin Young said at halftime. I don't know what was said internally amongst the players, but taking care of the basketball, just 3 turnovers in the second half, you can't discount that any but way that BYU did exactly what they needed to do to get a huge win. And it's going to engender a lot of confidence in these guys. They went to a really, really tough place to win, one of the furthest road trips they're going to take all season long. And they walk out of there with one of their finest victories of the season. Now it sets up, like I said, for a huge week ahead. You can take Kansas State down because K-State's among the hottest, if not the hottest team in the Big 12 right now, with 5 straight wins coming into tonight. I don't know at this juncture how K-State did. Let's see if I can pull this up here as we're going along here. But the bigger point to be made is they are setting themselves up to punch their ticket. Oh, wow. Okay. Kansas State is absolutely the hottest team in the Big 12. All they did, I just pulled this up, is beat number 13 ranked Arizona 73-70. So they have won 6 straight. They're going to be coming in brimming with confidence as they come to Provo this coming weekend. So it sets up for a major opportunity for BYU, but also at the same time, you can't get too out over your skis if you're BYU basketball. These are going to be very tough games. Kansas is a blue blood. They're one of the toughest teams to beat. They will take confidence, speaking of BYU, knowing that they went to Lawrence last year and won. But Kansas State, they're going to absolutely come and expect to win. I also expect the Marriott Center is going to be filled to the brim, and it is going to be epically loud. I fully expect The Rock. I expect all of Cougar Nation to fill that place to the rafters and be in full throat. And I, for one, cannot wait to watch it all go down. And obviously we'll have a full recap for you guys on our Locked On Cougars coming up over the weekend. We'll do postcasts after those games and everything. So we'll have you covered from top to bottom. But as always, truthfully, appreciate all of your guys' support. I made it through a live podcast here, so this is pretty fun. I will do more of these, I think, going forward. When you have impactful news like this with Tom Holmoe, I decided, you know what? Let's give it a shot. It's no time like the present to give it a shot. We'll do more of these in the future because now that I know I can get through it without like falling all over myself, we'll work it in. But as always, once again, thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. And once again, thank you to all of you who are everydayers with us right here on the Locked On Cougars podcast.